Good evening. My name is Aaron Russell, and I'm the Executive Director of the Smith Family Foundation. Our next event, which is going to be March 14th, is going to be Kelo and its Consequences. Should the homeowners fear the Supreme Court's decision? Debating will be Scott Bullock, who argued the case in front of the Supreme Court, versus Michael Dorf of Columbia Law School. So we hope you can join us on March 14th. Tonight's debate, should we stay or should we go, is going to be moderated by Gideon Rose. It's quite an honor to have Mr. Rose with us. He's the managing editor of Foreign Affairs. He's been doing that since December of 2000. From 95 to 2000, he was the Olin Senior Fellow and the Deputy Director of National Security Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations, during which time he served as chairman of the Council's Roundtable on Terrorism and a director of numerous council studies. He's also taught American foreign policy at both Columbia and Princeton. In 94 and 95, Mr. Rose served as Associate Director for Near East and South Asian Affairs on the staff of the National Security Council. In 1986 and 87, he was Assistant Editor of Foreign Policy Quarterly, The National Interest, and then before that at The Public Interest. Mr. Rose received his education at Yale, where he got a BA in Classics, and then went on to a PhD in Government from Harvard University. In addition to his coverage of the Iraq War for Slate, the online magazine, his recent publications include Understanding the War on Terror, which he edited with James Hogue, America and the World, Debating the New Shape of International Politics, How Did This Happen? Terrorism in the New War, and finally, Democracy, Promotion, and American Foreign Policy. Would you please welcome Gideon Rose?
Thank you very much, Aaron. We are very, very fortunate tonight to have what should be a very interesting discussion. There's an old joke about a fellow got lost in the forest, and he came into a clearing and he saw a house there, and he knocked on the door and met the farmer there, and he said, "Please, can you tell me I'm lost, and can you tell me how to get back to town?" The farmer thought for a while and said, "Well, the first thing is I wouldn't start from here." One might say that that's a good analogy to the situation in Iraq, in which all roads leading forward are, shall we say, somewhat compromised. There are a lot of questions about Iraq and how we got to this point. Some of them will be discussed at the next event, but they're not really relevant to tonight's topic, which is where do we go from here? Should we stay? Should we go? And what should we do next? I know people who were in favor of the war who support withdrawal. I know people who were opposed to the war who support staying and trying to make it work. I think that at this point, although there is some correlation between one's position up to this point, it's not a perfect one by any means, and there are very real costs and potential upsides to any particular option going forward. So it should be a very interesting debate. I can think of no two more interesting people to have that debate than our speakers tonight. A friend of mine just wrote or edited a volume called The Right War, ? The idea being that there's been a lot of debate about Iraq on the right, and that it's not a simple right-left phenomenon. And in fact, that's perfectly exemplified by our speakers. Shall we just say that one person, we have at this debate tonight, the Hudson Institute, the National Security Council, the National Security Agency, and West Point facing off against the Heritage Foundation, the Department of Defense, the CIA, and Annapolis.
Go Navy.
A rather impressive set of credentials, and hawkish credentials at that, on both sides. Again, just going to show that it's very hard to read off people's positions from their either past experience or lengthy credentials. Our debating advocates tonight are two very impressive people. General William Odem is a professor at Yale University and fellow at the Hudson Institute. He was a director of the National Security Agency from 85 to 88, during which time, as far as I know, he did not, in fact, listen in on our conversations. He was the military assistant to Zbigniew Brzezinski when Brzezinski was the National Security Advisor, and has had a long and distinguished career both before and after that, and will be taking the position that we should leave. taking the position that we should stay is Peter Brookes, who has had an extremely impressive career now at Heritage and a columnist for the New York Post and elsewhere. Has had an impressive career in the Bush administration, the Defense Department, in the intelligence agency, and in the military before that. So without further ado, I want to get to their contributions. Basically, the question is, should we stay or should we go? What do we do now? And we'll lead it off in the following way. Bill Odem will speak for 10 minutes, and then Peter Brookes. Then they'll have 5 minutes each rebuttal, back and forth. Then they'll answer some questions from me. And then later, after that, we'll have some questions from the floor. So without further ado, Bill Odem.
Thank you very much, Gideon. It's a pleasure to be here tonight. I think it's a subject that's too serious for debate, but I'll accept the format. I would also like to say that I'm not engaging in Monday morning quarterbacking. 3 weeks before the war, you can find in the Washington Post where I was quoted as saying, if we invade Iraq, it will please Iran, it will please Al-Qaeda, it will make it safe for Al-Qaeda for the first time, and it won't matter how they greet us when we come in, it will matter how they treat us after we've been there for 6 months. And if we think we're going to create a constitutional order in Iraq in a short amount of time, that must be a bad joke. So that was I've seen no good evidence to change that assessment. Perhaps you've heard or know of my many arguments. I can get into detailed arguments of why it makes sense to cut and run now. I'm going to take a different tack tonight. I think Gideon's advice not to look back is absolutely fallacious. Unless you look back, you won't understand the roads going forward. What I want to do is have you look at Iraq through the prism of Vietnam. And people, the conventional wisdom, it has nothing to teach us. Analogies may not have much to teach us, but they can offer some interesting insights. I break the Vietnam War into 3 phases. Some of you are too young to remember them, but us older people will remember them straight away. The first was from 1965 or 61 until 65. It began with a gross misreading of American strategic interests, and it concluded with the use of phony intelligence to put our troops in large numbers. President Kennedy started off rather ambivalent about deeper involvement, but some of his aides believed that to allow North Vietnam to take South Vietnam would open the door for Sino-Soviet domination of all of Southeast Asia. Accordingly, their rationale and their war aim became the containment of China. Dean Rush said that at least once a week, as long as I can remember in the 60s. Was it really in the American interest to contain China? In Vietnam, particularly in 1965, the Soviet leaders were already pursuing the containment of China themselves, not only in Southeast Asia, but elsewhere in Africa and South America and other places where they fought the Chinese Communist Party. This was a tragically flawed strategic rationale. The Johnson administration used an apparent Vietnamese attack on ships that we had in the Gulf of Tonkin in the spring of '65 to persuade the Congress to pass a resolution allowing him to introduce ground forces in large numbers into Vietnam. Now, we know that today that special U.S. operations forces were actually in North Vietnam. Navy SEALs were making incursions in there, and they played a rather serious role in prompting the North Vietnamese patrol boats to come out and do what was later represented as a casus belli by President Johnson. Thus, a misleading assessment of the intelligence became the critical factor in making a decision that led this to be not just Washington's war, but also making Washington's war as well as Saigon's war. Now, Phase 1 in Iraq is from 2001 to 2003, and it's like a rerun of an old movie. Most Americans and our allies believed in the fall of 2001 that we were at war with Al-Qaeda. But in the State of the Union address, President Bush told us that we were at war also with the axis of evil, Iraq, Iran, and North Korea. The American public took him seriously and believed that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction and was supporting al-Qaeda. But most of our allies did not buy this. And that was the beginning of the U.S.'s decline from the most popular and most widely supported country in the world to now it's down with Russia and a few other countries on the bottom. The strategic purpose was flawed and the intelligence was phony. It seems it certainly was not in the U.S. interest, but rather in the interest of our enemies. No country rivaled Iran in wanting to see Saddam overthrown. Saddam had invaded that country in 1980, bloodied the youth for a number of years, and a stalemate, indecisive, was reached in 1988. That President Bush would do this must have been beyond the Iranian cleric's wildest dreams. Al-Qaeda's interests were also well served. The overthrow of secular leaders like Saddam are higher on his list than the United States. We are a secondary enemy. They are a primary enemy. Furthermore, the invasion of Iraq made it safe for al-Qaeda, allowing al-Qaeda to kill more Americans more easily than it would have been done to do it in this country after 9/11. Bin Laden must have been ecstatic. Does this all sound familiar? I think it does. Phase 2, and this is in Vietnam from 65 to 68, was marked by the refusal to do exactly what Gideon was suggesting that we do, look forward and not look back. We would not reconsider the rationale that got us into the war. Rather, the debate focused entirely on tactical issues, how to fight the war. During this phase, no one dared question the strategic judgment, asking if it made sense. Instead, the debate went on how the war was fought, on search and destroy missions, on body counts, on pacification, and other such things. Now, as time passed and casualties went up, and the public, the costs were higher, and the public support fell, quite obviously. We could not afford to cut and run, I heard said a dozen times. The Viet Cong will carry out a bloodletting if we do. What did they think the Viet Cong was doing all those years we were there? Of course they were conducting a bloodletting. And finally, Senator Aiken answered the question that was often asked, but nobody wanted a real answer to it. How do we get out? He said, declare victory and come home in boats. Now, we move to phase 2 in Iraq, 2003 to the present. In an almost precise rerun of, phase 2 in Vietnam. Public discourse is focused on how the war is being fought. We should stay longer. Reconstruction was inadequate. Not enough troops were available. We should not have dismantled the Iraqi military. Elections will save the day. Read the New York Times' report on the election September 1968, and it's almost identical to what they said after the last elections in Iraq. Some of these criticisms of the war are valid, but they fail to address the fundamental issue, the validity of our strategic purpose. Al-Qaeda marched into Iraq, and where it dared not tread before, the White House refused to admit that it had allowed them in. As Iran's influence increases through the Shiite Iraqis, the militias and their militias expand, the administration refuses to confess that it has made this possible. Shiite politicians appear headed to dominate this U.S.-created democracy in Iraq. And no one is asking who lost Iraq to Iran yet. The Congress is showing signs of nervousness about where the war is taking the country. And Jack Murtha's call for a pullout echoed Senator Aiken's call for leaving in boats several decades earlier. Does all this look like phase 2 in Vietnam? Not entirely. In '68, the Democratic Congress proved willing to challenge a Democrat in the White House. The Republican Congress today has yet to show the same courage and wisdom. Now, phase 3, 69 to 75, was marked by Vietnamization and make-believe diplomacy in Paris. Policies still ignoring the strategic rationale and both fatally flawed. Vietnamization was a false promise for a very obvious reason. The key problem in Saigon was never training up the military, it was political consolidation among the elites. And as the military trained up, the generals squared off to fight for the power and ensured that you had a military dictatorship that was weak. In fact, the South Vietnamese military became pretty strong. The Paris peace talks were no less hopeless. That their designer, Henry Kissinger, believed that Moscow would help the United States reach a settlement short of total capitulation. In fact, by the late 1960s, the war was not only serving Soviet interests in Southeast Asia, it was also helping weaken NATO, it was hurting the U.S. currency on the international exchanges, and it was making publics in the countries among our closest allies, believe that we were an imperial power morally equivalent to the Soviet Union. The deeper into the big muddy, if you remember that old song, in Vietnam went the United States, the better for the Soviet Union. Second, Moscow did not have control over North Vietnam, and it could no way deliver them with a half a loaf in South Vietnam. Hanoi was playing off Beijing and Moscow against one another at the time, and they would concede nothing short of their final goal. As helicopters left the American embassy in Saigon, the illusions of these two propositions were pretty clear. Now, phase 3 in Iraq, we are in it. The debate's over. I think the administration has already made the decision. But we can see two flawed policies again: Iraqization and phony diplomacy in Baghdad over bringing a constitutional agreement among the three major factions. President Bush and Secretary Rumsfeld have been talking Iraqization since the fall of 2004. Now we're hearing Secretary Rumsfeld's scholastic rhetoric at Pentagon briefings about realigning the forces there, a code word for cutting and running. In Baghdad, we see the failing U.S. diplomacy aimed at achieving a constitutional deal among Shiites, Sunnis, and Kurds. We forget that it took a civil war from 1861 to 65 to do that here. Should we really believe that the Shiites, a majority of the population, recently traumatized by Saddam, will settle for less than full control if they can get it? Or that Kurds will surrender a decade and a half or more of autonomy? Or that Sunnis will peacefully surrender to these two other parties? Sure that a bloodletting will ensue in any case, and it is already taking place in the jails. You see these torture reports in what are really Shiite government-run prisons. They're really Shiite-run prisons killing off Sunnis. Now, phase 3 in Iraq, will it end like it did in Vietnam, with helicopters flying out of the green zone? Probably. The difference lies in the consequences. Vietnam did not have the devastating consequences on U.S. power that Iraq is having. Staying the course, however, cannot lessen the damage, and this is the thing you really have to learn. The things that are happening in Iraq that you don't like were inexorably going to happen once we crossed the boundary, no matter what we did. And until you understand that, you won't understand which directions are really open to us in the future. But even in these differences, Vietnam can be instructive. Once the U.S. position collapsed in Vietnam, we regained strategic flexibility. Our position in NATO went up, and things started looking well. Only a complete withdrawal from Iraq will give us the kind of strategic and diplomatic flexibility to regain some of our lost power. It will take much longer, and the big issue now is how many Americans we will lose arriving at the point where the helicopters leave the green zone. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Bill, in your next rebuttal, you can tell us what you really think. Peter Brookes.
Thank you. Wanted a subtle presentation.
Thank you, General. Thank you, Gideon. Anyway, sometimes listening to this debate, I feel like we're willing to commit suicide for fear of death. I think that leaving Iraq now would be a mistake of strategic proportions. Let's look at some of the possible scenarios, besides the history lessons the General was trying to teach us, of departure from Iraq at this point. First, if we leave Iraq, it would hand the terrorists a decisive victory and would certainly vindicate in the minds of many that terrorism is an appropriate political tool, and it would also vindicate terrorist tactics such as beheadings and suicide bombings. Leaving Iraq now could potentially provide a terrorist safe haven in a very important strategic part of the world, and which would allow them to further their extremist ideology. But winning in Iraq will be seen as a defeat for global jihad, undermining the terrorist movement, undermining their recruiting, cutting their funding, and debilitating their operations. Iraq certainly could become an operational base, just like Afghanistan, for jihadists, inspiring and encouraging their efforts to topple governments elsewhere. And I think you know who all those governments are. The fall of Iraq at this point, with an American withdrawal, could become a stepping stone for al-Qaeda towards its global caliphate. The next dominoes might be Egypt, it might be Syria, it could be Jordan, it could be Lebanon, Saudi Arabia, the Gulf states, Israel, or even Turkey. And certainly, we know that through Abu Musab al-Zarqawi, in the words of al-Qaeda leader Ayman al-Zawahiri, that they consider Iraq to be a crucible for their efforts to establish and achieve their goals. And they've also said, quite frankly, if you read what they've said, that this would also be a place to attack the United States. Although I think that would be difficult, it certainly is a possibility. What else might happen? Certainly, an American withdrawal at this point would create a political vacuum in Iraq. And a political vacuum would allow others to step in, and others might try to exploit. One of the biggest concerns, obviously, is Iran. We're talking about Iran today as the world's most active sponsor of state terrorism. We're obviously looking at the nuclear issue when we're talking about Iran. You're all aware of what's going on with that. We could end up with an Iranian superstate. Iran's desire for hegemony in the region. Iran might try to incorporate southern Iraq or Shia Iraq, adding another 14 million people to the 60 million Iranian Shia. They could also take under control Iraqi oil in southern Iraq, and also neuter Iraq as a potential future rival by cutting off their access to the sea. What would Syria do? Another neighbor, another nemesis, another pernicious state. Would they try to carve up a peace to try to create a greater Syria? That's certainly a possibility. Might we see a civil war if the United States were to leave now? And would that be in our interests? Could a civil war in Iraq among the Kurds, among the Shia, among the Sunni, what would that lead to? Once again, a political vacuum. Could we see the Iraqi Kurds end up fighting the Turks, a NATO ally of the United States? What would happen to other democratic movements in the Middle East? What about Iraq and Afghanistan have been inspirational to many in the Middle East? With this, we would lose the inspiration to place in places like Lebanon. We would also lose the pressure on despotic regimes that have tried to move in the direction of democracy and freedom. And if we pull up short, what would happen to American credibility in the world? With friends and with potential foes? How will our allies and elsewhere in other parts of the world, such as in Japan and Korea and NATO, how would they view the United States in terms of our political and security commitments to them as well? I'm going to sum up here. I think I've laid out the fact that there is a lot at stake in Iraq for the United States and American interests, from the global war on terrorism to democracy. Iraq today is the central front in the war on terror and the fight for democracy in the Middle East. What was originally a war of choice is now a war of necessity. It would be a major mistake, or a mistake of historic proportions, for us to disengage before finishing the job in Iraq. What we need to do today is to support a strategy for victory, not a strategy for retreat. Thank you very much.
5 minutes. Well, I don't want to be repetitive, but it seems to me that our first speaker has missed my points entirely. Decisive victory is for the terrorists. We ensured that in Iraq. It's already happened. You don't have a choice about it. And if you want to do the analysis of what we're up against, you have any idea what the capacity for an insurgency backed by Iran and Iraq could do to us today? They're holding their powder. They're telling the Shiites, don't start it. If you push Iran, if you think things are bad today, they will be much worse. All this was in the cards. Winning the war is not feasible in any terms that I can decide that I would call winning. I think the plan for victory that the White House put out is really like Nixon's plan, I have a plan for Vietnam. He was headed out. I think we're headed out, and I think the plan is right. I think those decisions have already been made. We are running out of army. We have insisted in the past on having a huge maritime force structure that puts us in a very small land force, that puts us firmly in charge of the porpoises and the whales and leaves the land to the tyrants. So we're not going to stay in this war, and we don't have the forces to do it. Stepping stones, dominoes, heard that before? Of course there are going to be some dominoes. There were some dominoes in Southeast Asia, Laos, Cambodia. But it didn't change the strategic equation. It may here, but you've already set it in motion. It's beyond your control. It's like you've just fired a shot into a man and he's bleeding to death, and you said, oh my, I can't afford to have committed murder, so I fire several more shots. That's what the choice is. There's a false notion that you can have victory. Iran, absolutely. Iran's going to come out of this a big winner. If it were my choice, I would really make a serious effort to establish some kind of rapprochement under the table with Iran. They offered us one, as the New York Times op-ed showed last week, in the early part of this administration, an opening to Iran, who hates al-Qaeda, who'd help us with the Taliban in Afghanistan, could really change things dramatically. Civil war in Iraq, as I've said ad nauseum, it's going on. Democracies in the Middle East, save me from democracies. Spreading democracy is a very bad idea. I've done a study on this recently. There are nearly 40 new democracies. Only 6 or 7, depending on 8, depending on how you count them, are constitutional democracies. The others are little liberal dictatorships. And I ask you, I challenge you to show me an illiberal democracy that became liberal and developed a constitution by repetitive voting. I didn't mention the Civil War here idly. That ought to be instructive to Americans. We didn't get ours by voting. We got it by bloodletting. And it has to be an agreement among the elites, and when they don't agree, you're not going to get a constitution. I don't see any of those countries with a constitution. Are they going to fall as dominoes? Yes. The issue is whether we're going to be the catalyst or outside, not to blame and trying to constrain the overflow. Finally, credibility. If you were a small country like France and a huge ego, you'd have to worry about it. You're a hyperpower. Credibility is the last thing in the world the U.S. needs to worry about. What we need to do is not squander our power in the name of appearances, but in substance. Keep your eye on real balances where they are. We will be the least hurt. The most hurt is the region. The next most hurt is Russia. It will free up all these al-Qaeda cadres to go to the North Caucasus and Central Asia. The Europeans will be hurt most next, and even South. We're already hurting East Asia by pulling our troops out of Iraq. That can unlimber things there. And finally, we'll be left here. So, yes, there will be all these terrible things. You don't have the option to change them. We better start thinking about how we're going to deal with these realities as we look ahead. Thank you.
I'm really surprised. I mean, I'm a post-Vietnam generation, but I'm really surprised that the general's trying to, equate Iraq and Vietnam. I mean, each one of these are very different. There's just so many differences between them. The insurgency doesn't have superpower support. They don't have Russia or China behind them. The military, the enemy we're fighting there is much, much different than we were fighting in Vietnam. And there's no significant support among the populace. We're talking about 20,000 insurgents in Iraq, probably. I mean, I know the number varies. Maybe 15,000 Saddamists, former regime elements, and then foreign jihadists and al-Qaeda, who don't agree on where Iraq should go in the future themselves. If we were to leave Iraq, they'd probably go at each other. Al-Qaeda wants a Islamic caliphate or an Islamic state, and the Saddamists want to come back in power and put their jackboot on the neck of the Kurds and the Shia. That's what they want. They don't agree about the future in Iraq. And they were talking about a country of 26 million people the size of California. And we have 15,000 out of that total that are supporting the insurgency. There's many reasons that the insurgency won't succeed. One is they have no clear ideology, which is very different from Vietnam, isn't it? We were talking about a motivated communist force. They have no clear ideology, and I just pointed out the differences between the two major insurgency groups. They have no great power backing, so it's not Vietnam. They have no positive agenda. Neither one of those groups provide the answer for the Iraqi people to live a better life. It's not Sharia law under al-Qaeda, and it's certainly not bringing back the Saddamists. There's no charismatic leader. Where's their Ho Chi Minh? The Saddamists, the 15,000 Saddamists, or three-quarters of the insurgency, don't look to Osama bin Laden or Abu Musab al-Zarqawi. In fact, there's a lot of isolated incidents right now, or anecdotal incidents, about these guys fighting each other. And that's something we should exploit. They hold no territory. There's no North Vietnam in Iraq. And that's they hold no territory. They run from hole to hole, from house to house. They hold no territory. They have no, and once again, they have no significant support among the populace. They couldn't disrupt the elections. They had 3 elections in 1 year. Very significant. They couldn't disrupt it. They have no political strategy to attract support. They cannot coordinate nationwide operations. You know, in Vietnam, I mean, I only read about it, but there was the North Vietnamese Army and there was the Viet Cong, and they were able to run operations from Hanoi to Saigon. And they were able to coordinate it. We don't see that today. And we're also seeing some progress on Iraqi security forces as well. They're taking on more demanding operations, they're more independent, and they're more capable. So I think that trying to compare, now I appreciate the general, I agree with the general that we only have history sometimes to teach us these sort of lessons. But it's wrong to try to equate Vietnam and Iraq. They're just not the same. Thank you.
See, I actually kind of agree with both of them, which is why I find myself stuck in the middle on these kind of things. So let me actually press each of them on a couple of points. General Odem, the argument has been made with regard to Vietnam that even as it played out, it was still worth it because the consequences of Vietnam falling in '75, regionally and globally, were different than they would have been for Vietnam falling in '65. And that even therefore, as a delaying action, one can make a case, a backhanded case for the war effort. One might tell you it was great cost and so forth. What about the argument that even if your strategic analysis is correct, the delaying consequences of a U.S. effort there, holding off, as you say, the things that could get worse down the road for a significant period of time would be potentially worth it, since, as you acknowledge, things could, and in your view, will get dramatically worse. You compared it to pumping several more bullets into the dead body, but your analysis wasn't that we were the problem, it was the problem was already completed. So there's no indication that things are actually going to hell in a handbasket on our watch, it's just that they might go after it. In Iraq right now. So do you think, what about the argument that even if what you say is correct, holding the fort for a while to hold off the consequences might be a legitimate investment from this point on, since sunk costs are sunk costs, and since the outcome you say isn't certain, but simply only probable by your view?
Well, first place, sunk cost is the argument really undercuts your position. You can't get it back by staying and spending more. But the real issue is, remember what happened with Tito. Ho Chi Minh was an old Comintern member who didn't like China at all, and he didn't trust Stalin and the Soviets. You would have had a regime down there that would have had 10 more years to mellow, and we would be recognizing it like we did under Clinton when you were down there. So we're just putting off a process that could take place earlier. That would be the first argument I would make. You see, this process of upheaval and change in this region, I quite agree with. What I find frightening and mistaken is that we become the catalyst and the cause of it. We should be figuring out how we're going to deal with the upheavals which are going to occur. So I don't see the argument of staying in there at all. I mean, I find, I just, We probably could have been exploiting the Sino-Soviet split earlier.
So the, so the bad things, it'll get worse. There's nothing we can stop that, but that getting worse is a necessary phase to get better after that, and we
Well,
should.
that's what we're going to do now. I mean, we've set this in motion. Yeah, we've got to deal with this. We've got to deal with all these things he talks about, and dealing with them is not staying immobily stuck in the sands of Iraq. It's getting out and regaining mobility. Look, do you think the Europeans are going to join us in any deal to continue to bore into the sand in Iraq? No. They will help us in Afghanistan, but I assure you, if the president called the European, asked the European leaders to meet him somewhere under some pretense, let's suppose he said it was, we're going to talk about the U.S. going back into the Kyoto Agreement or something. And he calls them to the Azores, and they talk about Kyoto. He says, well, I'm going to do it or I'm not. But then he says, the real reason of this meeting is I'm leaving Iraq, letting you know we're going to be out in 6 months. And I know you don't trust my leadership anymore, but go home and think about the consequences, because I think you're going to find they're worse for you than they are for me. If you're interested in coming back, I don't think you will follow a German or a French or a British-led coalition to do anything about it. But if you really want me sometime, give me a call. They'll be on the phone.
Peter, you were arguing that this kind of thing wasn't inevitable, what the general was talking about. My question to you would be, is there any indication that further efforts will ward these things off? In other words, if things haven't gotten, are you making the case that things have gotten better over the last couple of years, and therefore that if we hold out, they will continue to get better, or that the only reason to stay in now is to ward off even worse things coming down the road, in which case is there really some kind of strategy for making things better, or is it simply a negative argument that it could get worse and we can't let that happen?
Next question? No. No, I think no, I wasn't arguing that at all. Yes, that you could I suppose you could divine that from my comments. I mean, I think we have an end state we're heading towards. And there are challenges ahead. I'm not going to sit here and tell you that there aren't significant challenges for us. We still have continued Sunni disaffection, although more and more of them are participating in the political process. I still think it's very much, as time went on, they decided after 3 sets of elections, or 2 and 1 referendum, that it was better to be inside the tent than outside the tent. We have this, militarily, we're actually doing quite well. Now people are going to go, what does he mean by that? I mean, we're having terrible problems with these IEDs, these explosive devices that are killing many of our soldiers. But militarily, we're capturing and killing the insurgents in record numbers. In fact, there are plenty of intercepts of guys like Abu Musab al-Zarqawi complaining about this, complaining about lack of funding, complaining about the green recruits, and talking about how many of his guys we're getting. So militarily, in a lot of ways, we're doing quite well. The suicide bombings are another terrible problem. We talk about smart bombs. We learned from Desert Storm you could put a bomb down a chimney pipe, but the smartest bomb is the human being, and the suicide bomber is obviously. But they're killing more Iraqis than anything else. They're killing more Muslims than they're killing American soldiers. And as a veteran, I have friends over there. I was talking to a friend today, just got back, and every death is a tragedy. Of any service member is a terrible tragedy. But they are involved in military operations, which are obviously very, very dangerous. The Iraqi security forces need to improve. And then I think today, I was kind of traveling up here by train, but I think that, it was talked about on Capitol Hill today that we still have some challenges in governance. There's a lot of corruption in the Iraqi government. Seems to have been endemic before we got there, that they need to improve that. And reconstruction. There's still many places that we have real challenges with unemployment and putting people to work, and there are some real significant challenges there. But our end state should be a peaceful, stable, democratic, and secure and non-threatening Iraq. That's where we want to go. And you're right. But leaving, when I was Gideon, I was talking about at this point. If the debate that was going on, I guess really before Christmas, I guess it's going on here tonight about Iraq, about leaving. I think prematurely, I think we could have this sort of thing. And the other thing I want to talk about is I'm shocked at the general's lack of concern about, or I wouldn't say his lack of concern about Iran, but I think that being there is Iran's worst nightmare.
I don't think we helped Iran out at all. I think that us being our presence in the region and having 135,000 troops there and other forces in the region are really making Iranians think, especially about their nuclear program. So I think that I don't think this was a gift to Iran by any stretch of the imagination. And I don't know how people in this room feel about Iran, but I'm very concerned about Iran's nuclear program, and I can't think of any, perhaps worse nightmare today than a nuclear weapon or several in the hands of that mullahocracy. So I was kind of surprised at that. But I think we got to proceed ahead. I think we need to do better on reconstruction. I think we need better on governance. I think we're making progress. There are still challenges ahead, but I also think that the mainstream media tends to make this look worse than it is. And the guys that I talk to coming back, they tell me very different stories. They watch the news over there when they're in the chow hall or they're on break, and they say, geez, it looks a lot different on the street here than it does when I watch mainstream media. So that's, I'm not in Iraq every day, I'm in Washington, but I listen to the folks, the soldiers and Marines and airmen and Navy guys that come back, and they tell me a very different story.
General Odem, you wanted to?
Yeah, I'd just like to address that last point first, then 3 or 4 others. My son jumped into Iraq, spent some time there, and he'd go back. And I keep a network of young officers out there. Generally, captains are the best people to talk to. And consistently, if you ask them, how are we doing? 2 questions, at the tactical level and at the strategic level. They'll say, we're winning tactically, we're losing strategically. They're not confused. And I've seen that almost consistently anytime I've ever talked to anybody doing any of the shooting. Let me talk about end states. Can you imagine any regime that had any legitimacy in Iraq being pro-U.S.? I don't know where you've been all these years if you think you're going to leave a regime there that's going to be pro-U.S. Iran, if they're so frightened, why are they telling the Shiites to do exactly what the Americans tell you? The message we have delivered to Iran is that we've squandered our military so we don't have ground forces to come after them. We let Pakistan and India proliferate, and they're our big friends now. If you get a nuclear weapon, we become your friends. We know inexorably the Iranians are going to have nukes. The Russians are going to ensure that. So the choice is not how you keep them from having them. The issue is how you deal with that eventuality. And you better start thinking ahead. I'm back to Gideon. Let's look out into the future on some of these things. And what we're hearing now is the same rhetoric I lived through in Vietnam, the same rhetoric I've seen when the U.S. was involved in a number of other these exercises, which I've written a book about on internal war, in which I refer to it as colonialism by ventriloquy. We provide the money. And it turns out to supply both sides. You said there's no superpower supporting these people. Do you have any idea how much resources are coming out of Iran? Not to al-Qaeda, absolutely not, but to the Shiites, to Bani Sadr, one of our great friends. And you realize other sources of money that are going in there. Let me tell you, pulling out will ensure one thing. Nobody in Iraq likes al-Qaeda. They can't operate in Kurdistan. The Shiites will kill them in a minute. And the only reason the Sunnis tolerate them is they have lots of people willing to be suicide bombers. So there are few, and you can get rid of them. But that's only a small part of this problem. And the funding for the Sunnis, go to Syria for it. Go to a number of other indirect routes for it. So you don't have a one-for-one match of the Soviet Union and China supporting the North, but don't tell me the Iraqis don't have territory. I'm quite with Peter on the issue of fighting al-Qaeda, but we stopped fighting al-Qaeda and let Osama escape to Pakistan and went into this war that had nothing to do with al-Qaeda. And now we're being told that winning the war in Iraq is going to do something to help us defeat al-Qaeda. What's the record so far?
It's always so hard to prognosticate about these sort of things. Foreign policy is not engineering, it's not arithmetic. We're often fooled by things, the fall of the Soviet Union, many things have happened along the way. But it's my sense that if we win in Iraq, if we expunge terrorism from Iraq, it's going to be the death knells for al-Qaeda. You just read what they have said. In fact, I think John Negroponte, who's the director of national intelligence, said this the other day, made some reference to it in there, in his testimony before, I think, Senate Armed Services Committee, what they're saying about Iraq. Iraq they're not saying it's the last stand for them, but they're saying it's the most important stand for them. And when we win in Iraq, and this will be probably al-Qaeda's last stand. It won't be the end of terrorism, but this will take the wind out of their sails. It will hurt their recruiting, and they realize that. And that's why so many of them come there. And it has not, getting Osama bin Laden, I think, is an important thing. But it's not going to end al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda is an ideology. Getting him would be a good thing. Getting Ayman Zawahiri would be a good thing. Maybe it would make the movement collapse. But the Central Front in the war, there's more terrorist activity taking place in Iraq today than any other place. And it isn't by mistake that we haven't had a terrorist attack here in over 4 years, or accident.
Let me ask each of you another question. Let me start with Bill. You mentioned Tito. One reason I'm not entirely convinced by your arguments is not that I don't think they have a logic to them, but that I've heard similar kinds of arguments in other situations that didn't always pan out perfectly. And so I'm leery of saying that things are 100% certain to follow. You mentioned Tito. I actually was swayed enough by classical realist arguments of precisely this variety to have written against our intervention in Bosnia and then against our intervention in Kosovo on precisely similar grounds as the ones you're saying. It would entrap us into a difficult civil war among communal groups. It would be very difficult to provide stability and so forth. A lot of people argued that a real tragedy and a quagmire was waiting for us if we involved ourselves in the former Yugoslavia at various points. And we did, and what have we found? We found that although we could not make things dramatically better and perfect, and that while we're still there on the ground, in fact, I think most people feel that our interventions in both places have ultimately made some things better at a relatively legitimate cost, even if it's an ongoing commitment. Not everybody, okay, fine, but I think a lot of people who would otherwise have opposed the invasion. Certainly, I feel in retrospect that it went a lot better than I thought. So,
I've got it.
That point.
I got it. I was very enthusiastic for the intervention in Yugoslavia because we have a strategic interest there. We have strategic interest. It's a place we can go and stay for a long time. If again, you have to know the details. If you realize Serbs are not good fighters, the Tito myth has completely confused us about the place. We weren't going to bog down there. They never killed a single German officer during World War II in Belgrade. The only reason the Germans left Yugoslavia when they did was that the Ukrainian shock army was coming into Slovenia, and if they didn't stream out, they would have been caught down there. The Serbs have a lot of propaganda, and we could have, our big mistake was to bomb. I advocated very strongly, you can find it in the Wall Street Journal, where I said, don't bomb, invade. 2 U.S. tank brigades could have gone down the Vojvodina from Hungary, a new member of NATO, surrounded Belgrade, and turned the water and the lights off and said, give us Milosevic, and then we wouldn't be engaged in some kind of ventriloquy exercise afterwards. And we wouldn't have looked like cowards at 30,000 feet bombing for 75 days while people made us into terrible people for doing this all through Europe and creating a lot of anti-Americanism. Bosnia and Kosovo are in Europe. They're not in the Middle East. I am willing to undertake some of these transformations where the odds are not hopelessly against you. There is a Roman code law tradition in some of this area. There are land cadasters that show you where land. You ever looked at property rights in Iraq? You want to try to introduce something like that there? I think you could do so here. I also wrote in 1992 that we should intervene right now and put troops in all of the republics except Slovenia because this was eminently foreseeable.
Okay.
I mean, as Clausewitz says, there are no recipes, there are no laws. You have to make judgments on this, and when you start the war, chance, probability takes over. And but there are some structural things you can see that are going to constrain, move you in certain ways. And so getting a little glimpse through the fog sometimes is possible. I think a good study of Kosovo and Bosnia at the time would have made this very clear. And I think the same thing is true in Iraq. You'd see that intervention in one was wildly absurd, intervention in the other was going to be a hard pull. And by the way, they're not doing so well in either Kosovo or Iraq. Let me use a very crude metaphor. It's like scabs over pus sores, what we have there. The institutional underpinnings of both of those regimes are very weak and corrupt. Had we intervened fully militarily, removed the old elites, scarfed them all up and sent them to The Hague, and began to run the money systems and the banks ourselves rather than letting the parties run this, we would be much further along in transformation. And turning it over to the EU, and even when they're begging us to stay in Kosovo, is a strategic mistake.
What about Afghanistan? I had Milt Bearden writing in Foreign Affairs, someone who knew it better than anybody, saying this is going to be a disaster, be very, very careful, it's going to screw up. And it was before the ink was dry on his article, it had succeeded, at least initially.
Well, let me just respond to that. The war, I think, going in and taking Afghanistan is not all. If you could get in there, you could take it. The issue is what you do with it when you get out. I mean, after you're in there. Now, I don't think the game is over in Afghanistan. I'm willing to fight that war because we're against al-Qaeda. I can imagine a time when I might want to develop cover to withdraw from Afghanistan because it does become untenable. I want to keep my options open there. I don't want to be locked in to some kind of rhetoric. We're going to bring democracy to Kabul. I mean, it doesn't mean what it means there, what it means here. So these slogans, they resonate for us. They don't resonate there. And there's more possibility of them resonating in Bosnia. It's going to be tough in Kosovo. Albanians are a much different set of people. When you run into the clan structure of government that Albanians have, this is going to be really a tough nut to crack. And so none of these are going to be easy. You better choose your fights and not squander your forces where the payoff is not great. If you have the payoff in winning in Albania, I mean in Kosovo and Bosnia, could be economically very attractive for Europe and for us. I don't see that either in Afghanistan or in Iraq.
Peter, I'll let you have the last word on this, but I also want you to address one more question, which is, what would it take for you to be convinced by Bill's arguments? In other words, what are the indicators that would lead you to believe that things aren't working out, or is the position impermeable to evidence?
A strong drink. I just, as much as I respect the general, I don't see things the way he does.
That's clear.
Yeah.
That is one point we've gotten across.
I mean, it shocks me that he says, he sees, Kosovo and Bosnia as more strategically important in the United States than what's going on in Afghanistan and Iraq.
Europe's more important.
Let me finish, General. And then this is the only chance I get to, push back on a general. You know what I mean? I left the Navy as a commander.
I practically don't take this stuff from Navy guys.
They win at football.
That's right. What can I say? Anyway, but the fact is that he made a statement saying that we're fighting al-Qaeda in Afghanistan, but we're not fighting it in Iraq. Have you read any of al-Qaeda's statements lately? Have you seen Ayman al-Zawahiri on the tube? Have you seen Osama bin Laden heard his videotape? What is he talking about? He's talking about Afghanistan, but he's also talking about Iraq. We are fighting al-Qaeda in Iraq. Maybe it didn't start out that way, but it's that way today. Leave it. No, it doesn't. Yeah, I know you're chuckling, but we have to deal with the reality of today and where we're going today. Let the historians sort out that stuff. There's a lot of things we don't know, and there's a lot of things we may find out. But the fact is that what we're doing today? Osama bin Laden is hiding in some cave. In fact, in one of my New York Post columns, I hate to admit this, a couple of weeks ago, after we hadn't heard from Osama in 13 months, I said I thought he was dead. It kind of made sense to me. Or it was one of the possibilities, that he'd either gone deep underground, or he was planning another attack, or that he was dead. I mean, how can you lead an international organization and be absent for 13 months? And then he showed up. I think he's reading the New York Post. And I smoked him out. But the fact of the matter is that there still is a tremendous terrorist threat out there. And it's in Iraq, and it's in Afghanistan, and we are fighting Al-Qaeda, and we are fighting the war on terror in Iraq today. So I guess I'll just, did I answer your question?
Well, what
Oh,
is what would convince you that things are so far gone that there is no point or chance to make them better?
He answered it, a drink. which
Yeah, a
there's
drink.
No evidence of.
Yeah, nothing. I think that things are going better than the general seems to think. And I think pulling out is a major strategic mistake. As I pointed out at the beginning here, with Iran on the boil, and I don't believe that also if you become a nuclear power, you become friends. I don't think we're very friendly with North Korea these days. Maybe India and Pakistan. Each case is different. That's the point here. Each case is sui generis. It's, you try to look for lessons learned, you try to look for patterns. That's the challenge of a policymaker, that's the challenge of academics and historians. But unfortunately, each case is different. You can't equate Vietnam and Iraq. You can't equate Iraq and Kosovo. I mean, these things are different. And I just think it would be a strategic mistake for us to leave before we finish the job.
The televised portion of this will finish off now, and I just want to thank our guests very much. It's very rare to have people It's very rare to have people who really know what they're talking about actually tell you what they really think, and so we're very fortunate to have that opportunity.